All right, well, I just got back from some of the worst and slowest waiter service at a sushi place in my life. Ugh, it took forever. Anyway, so I want to talk to you about a writing problem. Let's say you're writing historical fiction like I am. How do you tell time pre-calendar? How do you tell hours before the idea or the concept of an hour even exists? Then, even more so, what about the politically incorrect, politically sensitive cultural stuff? I mean, in ancient societies, they were all ethnocentric. So, how do you deal with that kind of overt racism when it's politically inexpedient today to put in a novel? Or how do you deal with the fact that in ancient times, a woman would get married at 15, but a man doesn't get married till he's 30? How do you deal with that? Well, I'll tell you my answers. So first off, time. Depending on the culture you use, you can find, thanks to Google, you can find pretty much anything you need to find when it comes to dating. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to find good records, because pre-writing there are no records. So what do? Well, you take whatever the original language they used for telling time was, and then you apply that back to what you think it was. So, for instance, I have a character that is 20. So how do I say that in there? Because I can't say 20 years old. They don't have a concept of years. But they do have a concept of the cycle of seasons. So what I'll say is, depending on the age of the character, 15 springs, because springtime is youth. And then I'll say 5 summers, because summer is the age of your prime. And then you go until you get to autumn. So autumn would be, toward the end. And then you got your winter, which would be old age. So the way you can mark time in some cultures would be 15 springs and 5 summers would equal 20 years old. See, that's how I do it. Now, what about other cultures? Well, sometimes you can just mark the winters. So you can say, I've been through 15 or 20 harsh winters. Now, just understand that because time telling back then doesn't have the same consistency that we do now, their years and time will be a little bit off. So you might say, I've been through 25 winters, harsh winters, but the character might be 30. But they're only going to mark the winters that they remember. Okay, now, what about time? So that solves the other issue, but what about time? Well, time is going to be harder. So what you can do is look through ancient books, like see those green ones up there, right there? That's books in Greek, and they have Greek on one side and English on the other. And then the red ones, which I don't have up there, have Latin. And what you can do is you can see what they used to use for the ancient time periods. And now, pre-nation, each city-state or each group will have a different dialect and different words for hours, months, and years. So you wouldn't just use a generic term like spring, because every single society will have a different spring. You can't just say, 1 o'clock, because they don't have a 1 o'clock. So what can you do? Well, usually everybody has morning, afternoon, evening, or they'll have breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And depending on what culture you're in, if their focus is food, you can have when they eat be the focus of the time. If the focus is farming, you can have milking time, you can have sleep time, you can have like cleaning the farm time. You can use different ways to mark time. All right, well, so you got time. What about the problem that culturally some things don't translate well? For instance, like I said, in ancient cultures, people would marry off their daughters at 15, but the men that were getting married to were 30. How do you deal with that? My idea is simple. You simply acknowledge it. You have the character, if you don't want to be creepy, have the character be the proper age that we would be comfortable with. So have the female be 18 to 20, have the male be 25 to 30. but mark in the story that it's unusual for her to still be single, or mark in the story that it's unusual for him to want to get, for him to be married or not be married at his age. So that way, even though the characters are within what is proper in our time period, we acknowledge that it is odd to have what we would consider a proper relationship in that time period. So mark that. Now, what about the racism? Again, I say just acknowledge it. If you're in an ancient culture, like if you're in ancient Greece, everyone's going to be Greek. So you have a character in there that's not Greek. All the rest of the characters are going to have to acknowledge that that character is not Greek. If you go into ancient Judaism, if you're taking place in that area, the culture has a very strong bias against those who do not partake in the culture of Judaism. If you're in ancient Japan, Japan didn't like foreigners. So if you're going to have a foreign character in ancient Japan, you're going to have to acknowledge that they're not Japanese. Even if they are of another Asian descendancy, they still would be marked as an outsider within the nation of Japan. And also, at some point, what we consider nations or countries didn't exist. And little cities or villages would be their own individual nation, as what we would understand as a city-state. And so the further back you go, the further back you go in terminology. So understand that a lot of conventional stuff that we use to demarcate things like race, gender, sex, history, time, calendars, month, years, these things didn't always exist. It's hard for us to process that, but there was a time that those concepts were foreign to the human language. So when you're dealing with ancient history and you're dealing with stuff that is preconceptual, you're going to have to mark that in your story. My suggestion is that way you don't break believability, and so that way the suspension of disbelief continues throughout the story, is define your terminology early and then stick to that. So if they don't have a certain anachronistic word, I don't recommend putting it in there. So if they don't have the word hour, or they don't have the word year, or they don't have the word, camel, don't give it to them. Because if you give them camels, anyone who's familiar with that time period is going to be like, but they didn't have that yet. You can't have steel weapons in a Bronze Era time period. You can't have calendars like that. You can't have a calendar pre-calendar. Pre-Julian, that kind of calendar doesn't exist. You're going to have to go to a lunar calendar. And pre-lunar cycle, you're going to have to go to whatever you think they understood. So just understand that a lot of the stuff that we take for granted in our language was not always present. And the further back you go in time, the less language you're going to have access to. I recommend setting off early in your book the terminologies that you want to use to compensate for that lack of language that existed then, but so that way your readers can understand it now. And whatever rules you set down in the beginning, have a little side sheet that has whatever you're going to call an hour, whatever you're going to call a day, whatever you're going to call length, pre-measure, a palm length. I recommend finger length or foot length or several paces. Pre-mile, pre-kilometer, how do you say someone traveled 5 miles? Well, you might say a day's journey or half a day's journey. There are different ways, there are different clever ways you can come up with to marcate time and distance pre-modern convention. But just understand whatever terminology you use, you have to stick through that and make it consistent throughout the novel. And that when they go into a different culture, that culture won't have the same terminology. So it's just like with Star Trek, how somehow everyone speaks English. You're going to have to eventually acknowledge that there's a different language or a different culture out there that they are opposed to or are juxtaposed to. So anyway, that's my answer to that question. Peace, like, and subscribe. And keep on NaNoWriMoing, all you writing people.